The identity of freedom itself for a nation is very unique because other nations usually form identities around a common language, common tradition, or just a common peoplehood. But for us, we were kind of united on a abstract idea. Now, I think the benefit for this was a wide reach to different people. Now, the different people at that time were just all English, but the denominations of these English groups were oppressing each other, and those were the Puritans, the Anglicans, the Scot-Irish Presbyterians, and the Quakers. Now, you'd think that the English would just, get along, but of course, the Protestant Reformation didn't like that. So they did oppress each other a lot over disagreements on Christianity or whatever. But I think the ultimate question that we should kind of contemplate over is that what brought them together was that freedom itself, or the Declaration of Independence, because they fought for not necessarily a clear definition of what that freedom would look like, but more so of what they didn't want. And what they didn't want was the English taxes without representation. And that is a common theme, I think, that all the Americans could come together on. And this is kind of a setting of the stage for what the Founding Fathers will tackle later. Because ultimately the debate surrounds what that freedom should look like, whereas Thomas Jefferson is more so, he's kind of more premature with his freedom, where he takes on the simple approach to it, where do what you want as long as you don't affect other people's freedoms. And that's a fair take, but it's a lot more simpler than the Constitution or how the other Founding Fathers took the question of freedom, or what is the best way to avoid another monarchy that will oppress everybody. And ultimately, the disagreements led to the Civil War, and that when we don't have a negating country to point our finger at, we start to redefine what freedom means, or, change the rules around freedom, and we start to point the fingers at each other. And I think that was ultimately the biggest cause of the Civil War. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Pragmatically, I usually want to use these conversations to discuss or bring light to what we are using our freedom for today, or kind of directing our freedom. Because it seems like we kind of just get lost in the sauce when we just say freedom itself. And is the identity really strong? Can a weird trucker really identify with a weird goth person? Or the two have nothing in common other than they believe in the identity of freedom. They have the right to be their own way. And I find this lacking because if we're not pointing at somebody, I think the trucker and the goth person will end up pointing at each other. And I think that's kind of a weakness within the identity of freedom. But there's also a wider reach with it when we are in trouble, or say people who identify with freedom are in trouble. And yeah, I want to be a little bit more pragmatic. We're going to be going over the first legit affirmation of the question of freedom, which was the Articles of Confederation. That's when the Founding Fathers put on their big points and gave their own shot. And of course, this ultimately failed, but it's important to try to understand freedom by going through what the original intention was, or what they feared the most, or that is the people of the nation. But yeah, we're going to be going over the important quotes of the Articles of Confederation, and then I'll be talking more into detail about that. Going over the Articles of Confederation, I'll start with the third article. After I quote the first sentence, I'll go more into depth into what I think the Founding Fathers meant by the article and how it relates to freedom itself. All right, quote. The said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to, or attacks made upon them, or any of them on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any other pretense whatever. Now, I think the first thing to mention in this article that is important is that the United States was a league of friendship, or a firm league of friendship. It wasn't like we were all one organic body. We're all 13 organic bodies under this Articles of Confederation. You had the Quakers in Pennsylvania, the Puritans in Massachusetts, the Anglicans in Virginia, the Scot-Irish, eventually ending up in the Carolinas. And I think this article emphasizes that we understand that everyone's kind of different. We all have our own denominations, our way of worshiping Christ. But we still are friends in that we want to defend our freedom to worship Christ in this way, or in our own ways of doing things, not being controlled by taxes or who we can trade with and say what we're allowed to do. Because we want to have control over what laws our governments make. But what is also in the article is that they come together towards a common defense. They have a healthy relationship of outward unity when that freedom is threatened, but they kind of agree to disagree on small issues, like, say, the relationship between church and state. If people want a church and state government, they could kind of have that in their own little government, as long as they don't try to expand that beyond their say, state borders. But this unity is really reliant on the English oppressing them, you could say. They kind of came together on how the English oppressed each colony, and they would, of course, in the early days of the Revolution, they would send letters to each other how the English would mistreat them, and they kind of came together around the time of, I think, 1775, when shots were finally fired, and the Intolerable Act was really being enforced and troops were coming in, and that's when the boiling point reached. But I think they wanted to avoid another centralized, controlled government that really wanted to make everybody, you could say, one, in that they were all serving the king, and they didn't want another national government that was being served. And this kind of leads on to my next quote from Article 2, quote, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, end quote. So the people of the land, or what the Founding Fathers wanted, was the people of the land to be attached to the laws, and this is where you get the civic nationalism, you could say, where you kind of just engage with the society around you, the localized government, and you're kind of more well informed into how the rules are, or what the rules are, and what you're voting, what rules you want to vote in, and what the people are trying to live by. Now, what I think is important when he says independence and sovereignty is that we want our states to have their own identities or their own laws, really. We want the states to be known for different things. You could say California is known for its movies, Wisconsin is known for its cheese, and we can kind of build laws around the ways that these states thrive by having an independent government for each of these states, because some laws may work for one state, whereas it doesn't work for another, and kind of localizing that makes it a lot easier for the people, because if you nationalize certain laws that may work someplace, it doesn't always work in the other. So the national law wasn't really an option for them. They were very keen on sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Start with Article 6, quote, no state shall engage in any war without the consent of the United States and Congress assembled, unless such state be actually invaded by enemies, or shall have received certain advice of a resolution being formed by some nation of Indians to invade such state, end quote. Now, of course, this article is stating that we cannot fight others without the permission of the entire United States, because since each state is so independent, they all have their own armies, and they can act on the behalf of the whole entire United States. This law is basically stating that you can't without our permission, unless, of course, you're attacked first, because then we're not the United States. You're your own nation if you're not acting in the best interests of everybody. Because when we attack, or when you attack, say, Spain, then Spain's going to declare war on all of us, and not just you, because we're in this together, baby. So I think this article kind of tackles or highlights that there's two sides to what the Founding Fathers are working out in this Articles of Confederation. One side is wanting a free-loving, or a freedom utopia, which is kind of the opposite of a monarch, like where there's no hierarchy. It's kind of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That is what we want to maintain, and everything, all our resources are going to be put to maintaining that way of life and making sure a monarchy doesn't appear. And then you have the other side, which is kind of wanting the states to be united, have a realistic expectation that in order to maintain freedom, we have to concede that some things we can't just act out of freedom just because for freedom's sake. We have to sort of have a Congress, at least, to make diplomacy with other nations and sort of communicate with them, and know that there's other powers that be that will outplay us if we're not sort of coherent with each other. We're kind of just acting on our own. And okay, so we'll move on to another quote from Article 8, quote, all charges of war and all other expenses that shall be incurred for the common defense or general welfare, and allowed by the United States and Congress assembled, shall be defrayed out of a common treasury, which shall be supplied by the several states in proportion to the value of all land within each state. The main concern I think the articles are tackling is this security side to the tug of war, you could say, and that we are really focusing on what we all are working together for, and that is, of course, maintaining this freedom society. And this is kind of addressing the fact that because each state is so dependent or independent, they all have their own monetary currency. And this is kind of saying that everyone's got to pay their fair share when we do go to war. And because each currency is going to be worth differently, of course, in the last sentence, in proportion to the value of all land within each state, they obviously are going to use land to decide how much your currency is worth. Because currencies all are worth different. Because, I mean, if Virginia gave 500 Bitcoin to the national government to pay for state defenses, and Massachusetts only gave $500, obviously Massachusetts is going to be contributing less to the war to defending the states. And that's going to be obviously unfair. So obviously they had a understanding that if we are all free, it is going to, or if we are so free and independent, it's going to confuse a lot of things, but it's all worth it in the end if we can kind of come together on a Congress and somehow, calculate all this stuff out to so that all of it can be equal, especially when we're at war. We can kind of treat each other equally in contributing and stuff like that. But a general rule, I think, that the Articles of Confederation revealed is that the active power outside of keeping the whole together is really seen as a corruption of power. Note down about the Articles of Confederation, especially relating to freedom itself, because the Articles of Confederation was the first draft that all 13 states agreed upon for what this freedom itself should look like. It was the original affirmation. It wasn't just a negation. It was a system of governments after the independence was declared. This was the point that the founding fathers stopped becoming critics. They kind of put on their big boy pants and stopped just complaining about the enemy. They had to, you could say, complain about each other, but they were more focused on, pragmatic results. And of course, the up and coming new nation created a system. It ultimately lasted for 8 years before collapsing into bankruptcy. The National Congress ultimately failed because it couldn't fund itself. The states kind of just ignored their requests to fund the revolutionary funds. And obviously, the National Congress didn't have the military to enforce the requests, so they kind of just went ignored. They were kind of just, in the background, just writing them letters and kind of being ignored. Now, I think what is really important here is that the Articles of Confederation proves that the freedom itself is a principle, but it isn't something that can take one form. It takes many forms. Because if it did take one form, obviously, it wouldn't exist because the Articles of Confederation kind of failed. So the freedom itself thing obviously couldn't be bound up into one system. It had to be flexible, you could say, and that is the, you could say, positive force of negation. And my claim is that freedom is the heart that pumps all other American identities around it, and that is the ultimate question that the other identities claim to answer or claim to be the synthesis of. It is really answering the question of what is freedom and what it should be used for. Now, after the Articles of Confederation eventually failed, the founding fathers had to get back together and decide what the freedom was supposed to look like in the nation. Of course, what was proposed was the Federalist case. They wanted a more centralized government. It was represented by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, and was eventually adopted by George Washington. It really favored the elite class. They wanted to build a lot of wealth for the nation, you could say, to secure themselves, to prosper. And then what formed ultimately against the Federalists were known as the anti-federalists. They were kind of represented by figures like Patrick Henry, George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, even though he wasn't there. But he eventually became the third president, and you could see a dialect was beginning to form, as John Adams and George Washington were more Federalists, and the Thomas Jefferson was a anti-federalist, you could say, in spirit, even though he was a Democrat Republican. We don't got to get further into that. But the anti-federalists were really country folk people. They were farmers. They were people who didn't want the federal government controlling who they would trade with, what they would be taxed, things like that. So what all of these, you could say, both Federalists and anti-federalists had in common was that they all outwardly at least supported Christianity. There were deists like Thomas Jefferson, but they still spoke positively about it. And then the second thing that both of these sides had in common was that they had a desire for freedom. They had this ideal principle set of debating and intellectually actually, engaging with each other without taking each other's freedoms away. And ultimately, I think it kind of worked in that a better system was made for that debate, because the handful of denominations kind of came together around this ideal, and even so much so the Anglican Church became the Episcopalian, and they kind of focused more on the freedom aspect, and they kind of, worked it out. I'm going to be going over figures that were pre-Jefferson. They were the influence, the prologue to Thomas Jefferson's eventual triumph of the opposing side to the Federalists, the representative for this freedom itself mentality. And I'm going to start with Patrick Henry. Of course, he is famous for this quote, but I'm going to go ahead and quote it. Quote, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." End quote. Now, that was Patrick Henry in one of his most famous speeches. And I think we should note is that the freedom itself mentality is a very, very oral tradition. It wasn't initially intellectually fleshed out. It was more so an instinctual feel. It was Patrick Henry kind of ranting on speeches, but not really reading himself. I mean, Thomas Jefferson noted that in his autobiography. And it's really accessible to, you could say, newcomers or people who kind of look at the nation and see how different it is from other nations. It's very simple, but the energy is very radical. They're kind of defiant of this principle. There's kind of a no-go when freedom is taken away, and that kind of established itself as, say, an American thing. But I think the shortcomings of these, you could say, figures before Thomas Jefferson, they did influence him heavily, but there wasn't much depth to it. It was just repeating freedom a lot. And there's some pros and cons to that. It's very understandable to the people when they hear a speech that you could say has a freedom cry. But as for intellectually, you could say beyond the times of that moment of speaking, it wouldn't really establish itself you could say, in the spirit for the next generation. It kind of would die off just being a trend, you could say. But I think Thomas Jefferson was kind of an antidote to that in that he established a school. He wrote books. He wrote his autobiography, and he wrote, I believe, a notes on the state of Virginia, which was very influential on the Constitution and where the country was going to go. But now I want to move on to another figure that is well known in the Revolutionary War. This was before Thomas Jefferson became, you could say, the father of freedom itself. So this is from Thomas Paine's book on common sense. It was a pamphlet that was spread throughout the colonies making the case against the British crown and for American independence. So, quote, "It is the pride of kings which throws mankind into confusion," end quote. Now, this is a short little one-off sentence, but it's kind of important in that there's always this clash in the English civilization, if you actually study it, is that it's always a battle between Parliament and the monarch, where the monarch is constantly enforcing the law, and then the Parliament is supposed to be checking the powers on the king, making sure he's not over using his power. And I think Thomas Paine, being an immigrant from England, kind of wants to remove that monarch element and just make a pure parliament or House of Representative instead of House of Parliament. And of course, we have that today. Now, the influence of this through the Puritans, I think there's a book called The Pilgrim's Progress. It's a fictional book that was very well read throughout the colonies, especially if you were a Puritan. And it kind of displayed the king and the pope as something that would corrupt, you could say, our religious journey to become closer to God or to the ideal heaven on earth. Now, the kind of sentiment of that is we're being abused, we're being dragged away from, you could say, a clearer vision of what we want the world to be. And they were kind of sick of the English kings talking a lot about freedom and bragging about how their nation is a lot freer than other societies, which it was. But whenever it became hard on, you could say, the king, and he was really getting sick of stuff, he would kind of overreach on his powers and break laws. And you could see that when the English kind of made the Americas seem like a state that couldn't or wasn't able to have rights because of the pragmatic, you could say, extraction that they wanted from the nation, or they wanted to get more out of the colonies than give. And that was what led to the taxes. Now, to continue on to the spirit of the Founding Fathers, I'm going to quote common sense again. And this is going to continue this monarch and parliamentary dialect, you could say. And in that dialect, what arose out of America was a completely casting out of the monarch. We can see it in this quote. Quote, "Though we have been wise enough to shut and lock a door against absolute monarchy, we at the same time have been foolish enough to put the crown in possession of the key," end quote. Now, obviously, he's saying that the crown is the executive branch, and when the rules were kind of broken, the parliamentary couldn't do enough to overcome the crown, because the crown obviously had the keys to how this whole system is going. And essentially in America, or the English of America, they only really felt patriotic for the monarchy when it agreed to freedom, but usually when it got hard for the king, he would usually overreach on his powers. Now, of course, Parliament had more control, of course, after 1688, but it is more so how the Americans felt about Parliament, and that they were kind of a force that was acting as though they were a tyrant or a king in themselves. And of course, they kind of blamed the king because he agreed with the sentiment of Parliament because they needed to pay off a lot of debt. With the John Dewey, anti-federalists, we're going to go ahead and quote him as well here. So, quote, "If thoroughly looked into before it is adopted, the people will be more apt to approve of it in practice, and every man is a traitor to himself and his posterity, who shall ratify it with his signature without first endeavoring to understand it," end quote. Now, Dewey is talking about the Constitution, but we got to understand the spirit of it more so than just his stance against it. But even then, the Constitution had too much power, of course, amongst this anti-federalist sect. And they saw actually when a government abused its power and the people agreed to it, would be a traitor to themselves because they're having power, essentially take away your rights for the benefit of themselves. And essentially anybody who's a traitor to himself in that way is kind of pathetic. And when you're called a traitor, obviously that's probably one of the worst accusations. And to call a traitor to yourself is kind of embarrassing and kind of makes you pathetic, you could say. And the whole spirit in the room of the Continental Congress kind of reveals itself that freedom was the ultimate sign of the good, you could say. And your respect was kind of reliant on your ability to, you could say, freely debate someone without wanting to take away their right to debate. And you could say, especially amongst the anti-federalists, their kind of sect, when they would recite or cite their own thoughts on freedom itself, they would always cite Switzerland as an ideal or a role model to what freedom should look like. Now, they're a nation that is usually passive on every war that happens around them. They don't really do anything that inflicts power onto other nations. They're a passive nation. They kind of like to just chill out in their farms and grow crops and make a little bit of money here and there. And that's kind of what the anti-federalists are, you could say, advocating for. And eventually Thomas Jefferson kind of takes up that mantle. Now, I think we should also note that power is the ultimate enemy, and I think the Federalists understood this, and they argued that under the Constitution, power would be used to undermine each branch. So the branch would kind of, you could say, they would be advocating for power for themselves, but ultimately each branch had the authority only to do certain things, and all the authority that would go to one branch, it would ultimately outweighed by the other. That was kind of the idea, and that you can make build yourself up in one branch, but you couldn't do it in all the branches unless if you had like some crazy hypnosis on an entire population and had like a huge network of people. But that's pretty hard to do. But some people argue that still exists, or that exists now, and we're kind of screwed. But I just wanted to note that the greatest sin ultimately was forcing someone to do something without wanting them to do it, and that's kind of the whole spirit I get from the radical negators of the English. Now, to conclude this video, I'll get to the man himself, Thomas Jefferson. Now, I like to think of these figures that I quoted before as, you could say, the seed of this freedom itself, whereas Thomas Jefferson is the fully grown, or you could say, the premature tree that ultimately comes about. Now, I think the first tree, or you could say, fully grown idea or identity was the constitutional identity, but the freedom itself identity was before the Constitution. It was, you could say, in the 1770s, early 1770s, when the say negating behavior started to or manifest into the people, and it was the first seed of what would eventually accumulate into this Jeffersonian kind of idea of decentralizing power as much as possible, and you could say opposing the Federalists. Now we'll start within Jefferson's inaugural address. Quote, all too will bear in mind the sacred principle that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will, to be rightful, must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal laws must protect, and to violate would be oppression, end quote. Now, of course, he's focusing on the minority because I think the founding fathers knew that sometimes the majority would go crazy, but there's a standard, you could say, and it's not being upheld by the legislative branch or the executive branch. It's being held up by the judicial, and that the Bill of Rights and the amendments are supposed to create the standard that you cannot actually break this liberty onto individuals, even if they were outvoted. There's a standard that you cannot, or a line you cannot cross. And that standard usually is freedom cannot go against restricting other people's freedom based on some, you could say, taboo thing, like say the Jeffers or Thomas Jefferson being a deist. You can't like oppress deists like Thomas Paine. And I think there's a kind of a bias in this quote in that they themselves were possessing weird beliefs that you could say would normally would be shut down by other people or governments by calling them blasphemers and heretics. But here, this was a lot more tolerable because they needed it to be a lot more open to more people because there wasn't, you could say, one denomination. There was multiple that needed to get along and come together on something. And of course, when you open that door, you have to open it to everybody, or at least that's what Jefferson wanted. Because in private, he was obviously not as religious as he presented himself to the general public. But I think the sacred freedom of this freedom, you could say identity, is that you need to be able to debate the ideas, and that I think in the inaugural address, Jefferson talks about we are all under the Federalist camp and the Republican camp, and we were all kind of under that in the idea of pursuing, you could say, truth around the ideal of what freedom is, and that we can kind of come together under that sort of idea. Now, moving on, we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence, which was a better, you could say, feel for this freedom itself, identity, because later in Jefferson's life, he really wanted to live through the Declaration of Independence spirit, because in his old age, when he reread it, he was in the mood, you could say, of kind of, yeah, we should do this again, or we should feel this spirit again, you could say, in the words of what he was writing at that time. Okay, so quote, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces to a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government, to provide new guards for their future security, end quote. Now, that was from the Declaration of Independence. I think Thomas Jefferson, or everybody, kind of knows that if the system ultimately fails, then the people have the right to destroy it. And even this applies to the constitutional identity, which is why I think the freedom itself identity is a lot more survivable, though it's not as meaningful. It is something that will always survive, even if the Constitution ends up failing and you could say the people replace it with something new. So this is essentially the foundation, and the foundation for all other, you could say, identities that spring out from this. Now, important things to note about the freedom: it's about allowing people to prosper, to, you could say, get money for their work, not be taxed to oblivion, and it's also about having the government protect that other individual that wants to steal from you, gives you some security, and um, from the majority, you could say, if it turns on a minority. And if ultimately the government doesn't live up to this ideal, then it is ultimately worthless. Now I'm going to end this, but I'm going to cite all the works that I read for this video. And I just kind of want to end on a note of understanding like what people say when they say, um, I want to be able to do what I want. That's what it means to be American. It's kind of true, but it kind of isn't. And that's, there's not one coherent thing. But yeah, that is the core, you could say. You can't have an American without freedom. So yeah, that concludes the video.